and it'll be on the YouTube channel. So unless we say some, unless we go into some kind of classified area, and then we
Horrible
decide
direction, sure.
we have to redact,
Sure, sounds good.
Yeah. Okay. So, hi to everybody who's listening in here. This is kind of a new experiment, where actually Adam reached out and said, "Hey, I've got some questions about applying ShapeUp in this kind of new context that he's in." And I said, "Okay, well, how about we try doing it in a live format so that other people who might have similar questions, or who knows where we're going to go, we might also just kind of make some stuff up and learn some stuff
Sure.
along the way here, so that other people can benefit from it." And this is something that we'll try to do again and again, actually, on this platform, of talking to folks who are trying to apply it, and then learning from each other about where it works and where it doesn't work, and sort of how to adapt it to different situations, or when to not adapt it at all and do something totally different, right?
Yeah.
Let's see kind of where this goes. So how did we get here, Adam? Do you want to
Yeah,
give
sure.
us some context?
Sure. So of course, I've been a big fan of 37 Signals and Basecamp for many, many years, and followed a lot of the work that you guys have put out in terms of how you work for a long time. Attended the How We Work workshop at the office in Chicago
Oh, that's
before
right.
you guys shut that down, which was
Man, that's really going back.
yeah, which was really cool. And that was really exciting for me because I learned a lot about how you actually use Basecamp in ways that I didn't expect. I talked to Jason about this on my podcast a couple of weeks ago, but um, it was a really inspiring experience to see just how much you actually do in the tool, instead of rather than just managing projects. It's really about managing the whole company, which was really interesting.
And what kind of work were you doing at that time? When you came to that event, were you doing web development work, or
Yep.
what?
I was so actually I wasn't really in the best place to really sort of make much of what I was learning there. It was more at the time I was working on info products. I just left my full-time development job, and I had, because I'd released a fairly successful book on sort of functional programming for PHP developers, and I was sort of doing more of that stuff. So just very independent work, which means
that's super interesting. I never saw that, actually. Functional programming for PHP. That's cool.
Yeah. It's pretty fun. So I really just came because I'm such a huge admirer of the company and the way that you work. And I thought, I'm going to learn something here that's going to be useful to me one day, no matter what. And it would be just a really cool experience because it doesn't seem like it happens very often. And you, Jason, and David were all there. And I know David's not there very often. It's this would be a cool one to go to, really just get to be a part of this thing. So, so that was really cool. And then when ShapeUp came out, of course, I was really excited to read that, and read it, and it all made perfect sense. And a lot of it was sort of building off of ideas that you had shared in the past, years and years of, learnings through your Felt Presence blog and through the Signal versus Noise blog and all over the place. So it's cool to see all that distilled into one place. And it all made perfect sense to me. And I was like, yep, this seems so straightforward and exactly how you should do everything. And then, of course, we start hiring people to work at our company that we're working on now, which is building open source tooling and sort of design resources for developers. And as soon as I start to schedule our very first project as a team, when it's no longer just me and my co-founder who sort of just fly by the seat of our pants and make things up as we go, all of a sudden it's wait a minute, I immediately have all these specific questions that I never would have had if I didn't actually try and put this into practice. You know what I mean? So I sent you an email seeing if maybe you had some time to chat with me about it and give me some of your input on some of the stickier parts. And we thought it would be a cool idea to do it as just a live stream so that more people could benefit from it, which is funny because there's this there's a link here over years where, I don't know if I've told you this before, but when I started the Full Stack Radio podcast years and years ago, literally the reason that I wanted to start that podcast was because I'd been reading a lot of your work and I had a bunch of questions for you. And I thought, if I just email Ryan, he probably won't just jump on a Skype call with me and just talk with me for an hour. But if I had a podcast, maybe he would come on the podcast, because at least there's some output.
You create a
yeah. So this feels like it's like that all over again. You know what I mean? Which is kind of fun. So
Funny,
yeah.
yeah. So what is Tailwind, and what do you try to do there, and kind of where are you at today with it?
Yeah. So Tailwind itself is an open source CSS framework that we put out like at the end of 2017 that has picked up a bunch of steam and people are really into it. And
What like when does somebody reach for a CSS framework, and like why do they reach for Tailwind? Like what's that doing for people?
yeah, so kind of the value proposition for Tailwind is that it's a it tries to fill the gap between like doing everything completely from scratch, like opening an empty .css file and kind of starting from nothing with no
Uh-huh.
conventions and no a architectural approach. Um, but it tries to not go as far as something like Bootstrap, where it's like we have a lot of opinions about how buttons should look, how form inputs should look.
Mm,
And my experience has always been that when I try to build like a side project or something, I want to start like somewhere above like nothing because I want to move a little bit faster. But when I
uh-huh.
start with a lot of the stuff that existed, it was really hard to sort of put my own sort of visual look on things because you're doing all this overriding and there's not a lot of clear information about like what is the idiomatic way to like make a button
Yeah,
that's a new color. Should I be editing the SAS file? Should I be writing custom CSS? Should I be, you
interesting.
know?
It's like there's
Um,
this gap between like either you have nothing, or you kind of like have too much
yeah,
structure that you're sort of stuck with. And then already like if you use something like Bootstrap, you kind of immediately out the gate look like all these other projects, right?
yeah, and you have to resist that basically, which is a bit of a challenge. So
Uh-huh.
Tailwind tries to sit in the middle where we give you a bunch of useful constraints, but we don't give you anything big enough that it's going to be like recognizable. So
Hmm.
it's worked out pretty well so far in that regard. We kind of pitch it as like a CSS framework for rapidly building custom user interfaces
Oh
rather
man,
than, yeah.
I can totally see this is so funny. This is starting to sound like an ad, like because I'm actually thinking I have a like a side project right now, and I'm thinking like I actually need this. I could totally use this.
Yeah.
Like this is
Well, you should
sounds like the
try it.
right level of abstraction for what I'm looking for,
Yes. Yeah,
because
try it out and let me know what you think.
well, things have evolved to the point where when I open up like a blank CSS file, it feels Stone Age, and I just feel like I'm doing it wrong,
Mm,
And then I've had that struggle of looking at the different frameworks and feeling like they're all kind of overly modularized and like overly, I don't know what to say, but they kind of go too far, right?
yeah,
So that's cool. Okay, so you get this open source thing out
yeah,
there, and then how does that turn into a like what is it sounds like
yeah,
it's turning into a business now. Like what's that?
exactly. Yeah, so it, picked up a lot of steam just as an open source project, saw a lot of adoption, which was really cool, and it continues to grow rapidly today, which is really exciting. But because we sort of deliberately picked this sort of stopping point for the framework, which is like don't impose meaningful sort of visual design decisions on people's projects, there's a lot of
Ah,
people who see Tailwind, are excited about it, like the workflow, but feel like I still can't make something that looks good with this because like I don't know like what padding to put on a button or what I should
interesting.
do on the hover state. Like I need more opinions. You know what I mean?
So
So
is this like are these primarily more developer types who don't consider themselves designers who are
yeah,
trying to fill the
I would
gap?
say that's generally like our who we who's using our tools the most for sure.
That's fascinating. That's so
Yeah,
fascinating because it's like if you look at it from a kind of like a value chain standpoint, there's this like a bootstrap is kind of covering this whole spectrum where it's one piece that's taking you from nothing to having a visual opinion of how you should look. And then you've kind of unbundled that into like this framework level, but then you leave this gap open that's like
exactly.
unaddressed.
Yeah,
And if you're a designer, you can come in and integrate there yourself and fill that gap. But if you're a developer, like that's still
it's still
uh,
open. Yeah.
so there's some kind of non-consumption there. That's interesting.
So that's where we decided to like figure out, okay, well, maybe this is where we can do something commercial, essentially, right?
Mm.
So we built this. Um, the, we have this product which is Tailwind UI, and if you wanted to look at it, you could go to tailwindui.com and sort of get a sense for what it is. But it's basically a big directory of much more like opinionated component patterns, like built with Tailwind. And Tailwind as a CSS framework is sort of like the simplest way of explaining it is everything happens in your markup instead of in your CSS. It's very low level little utility classes, which is
Okay.
convenient for us because it means our deliverable is just pure HTML. So we just
So it's
give you
very
like a bunch
like
of these.
declarative and compositional.
Yeah, exactly. So like, I don't know if there's like is there like a chat thing here? Here's like a link to like a specific one where if you were to look here, like this is like a collection of call to action blocks that you could stack on a marketing page. And the
I'm
idea
gonna
is to
actually
sort of,
post this. There seems to be a public thing, a public chat, which I think is maybe the
oh yeah,
YouTube thing. I'm
yeah,
gonna
yeah,
drop it in there.
cool.
Yeah.
So this is just like, you know, it serves as both inspiration and like implementation, but it is designed to be customized. So you can just go here and grab like the actual HTML snippet. And I don't know like what the
Oh,
experience is on this
interesting.
page if you're not logged in, if there's like a free one. Yeah. So at the very top, you can see there's like a preview tab and a code tab. You just grab that snippet and now you own the code, right? It's not like something that came from a library. So you can change the copy, you can change the colors, you can tweak the font size, but you
Dude,
have
this
like
is
a
so
starting
interesting.
point.
This is really
Yeah,
interesting.
cool.
Okay.
Thanks. So
Yeah.
this is like what we build, and we sell this as like a basically a lifetime membership to this like sort of private directory, essentially, that we're still continuing to build out over time and stuff. And there's two sort of top level categories. There's like a big chunk of marketing site components and then application UI components. And we sell those separately or bundled together. And we put that out in like February, at the end of February, after the CSS framework had been out for about 2.5 years. And it's done like close to $2 million US in revenue since then. So there was like a
Oh, that's awesome.
big need for this. And it's been great because like we're able to make like a commercial thing that competes with like open source things in a way. And it's good for us because we still have the open source CSS framework kind of powering it all, serving as like the funnel to sort of bring people to this.
I love that. I like there's a case study to be written here about like where you draw that line between what is that public framework and then like where you're doing the custom
Yeah.
implementation on top. That's like fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks. So that's like what we do from a commercial perspective, but a lot of our work is also just continuing to do open source stuff because that's what fuels our ability to do commercial stuff. So
Interesting.
developing the
Yeah.
framework, developing like new tools and plugins for the framework. So like for one recent project, for example, is Brad, who's our first hire, just launched like a VS Code Tailwind CSS IntelliSense plugin that
Ah.
just gives you all these diagnostics and stuff when you're in your editor, telling you like, hey, you've applied two CSS classes that target the same CSS properties. So this is probably a mistake. You know, you want to fix that. So, and that's like not something we charge for or anything, but it's just one of those things that makes people's experience with our tools better, which just feeds into everything, right? So we do a
Yeah.
lot of stuff like that still, and we have a lot of other big open source projects kind of being shaped right now that
Yeah.
will eventually lead to our ability to charge for other new stuff in the future. So there's sort of these like two um, sort of yin and yang branches of the business.
Well, this parallels with kind of what I saw Jason and David doing with Basecamp, which was like they were like creating an audience through a lot of stuff that they were giving away. You know, I think especially early on, like that's the way to think about signal versus noise. It was a way of creating an audience,
Yeah.
and then you if you can create an audience, then you can sell into that audience. But then you kind of have to keep investing in both.
Yeah,
Like you have
100%.
to, yeah.
And I think that's a mistake people often make. They build this big audience from building like free stuff, and then they get a taste of what it is like to be able to sort of capitalize on that and turn that into
And they
something
try to just
commercial.
like they try to just like flip
And
it all into
and
the
they forget
commercial.
about what got them there in the first place, you know what I mean?
Yeah, yeah.
Um, so that's something we're trying to be pretty careful of, at least. So
Okay,
yeah,
so
that's kind of like the overview of, the big picture of what we're doing.
yeah, and then so it was you and a co-founder, and what's the role split between the two of you?
Yeah, so Steve is my co-founder, and he is like just a visual designer by trade with like
Uh-huh.
some HTML and CSS chops, but not like writing HTML that people are going to buy, sort of HTML and
Yep.
CSS chops. Something he's working on, but like, yeah, our roles have basically been development and design.
Uh-huh.
And then, marketing and stuff is sort of a shared effort and product strategy and stuff. So that is kind of the setup that we have.
So all the stuff, if somebody if somebody looks at a component in this library and says like thinks like that looks great, that's like coming from his design direction, and then you're helping to sort of implement that in the most nerd correct way.
Yeah,
Like,
exactly.
okay,
Exactly. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And then also building like all the tooling and stuff that even makes it possible for us to do all this stuff. So um, all the open source framework. And Steve helps a lot with like, okay, let's figure out what the default color palette should be and really battle test these colors against a bunch of different
I
UI
see.
ideas and make sure that these two purple shades are close enough to be useful, but not far enough to be, like
Yep,
lots of kind of design R&D and design systemsy work that kind of goes into that too.
yep.
But yeah, that's kind of been the split.
Okay, and then you said that like when it was the two of you, everything could just sort of be chaotic, but now you started to bring in more. Is it just the third that you brought on board now, or is
There's
there more, or what's
Yeah, there's
happening?
three of us like currently working, but we also have two more people who have been hired who haven't started yet.
Uh-huh.
So
And okay, and who is the third again, and what's his role?
so the third is Brad, and Brad is a front end developer, but also just kind of a can do anything developer, just like
Uh-huh.
a really talented guy who loves to get deep into bleeding edge stuff and figure out what's possible. And we
Yep.
hired him because he had already been maintaining this Tailwind IntelliSense plugin, sort of like the first version of it,
Uh,
but it's in his spare time. And we see that as like a really important project in terms of people having a good experience, and we wanted to put resources into making sure that that was like able to be maintained properly.
mhm.
And we also could use Brad's help in a lot of other different areas. So we hired him with a role of like developer experience engineer is what we called it, which is like
Oh,
building
interesting.
stuff to improve the developer experience of people using our tools. But at the same time, the reality is when you're only three people, a lot of time we just have to pick what is like the most important thing to do, and we all just kind of have to contribute to it however we can, right? So
Yeah, because you can't really like departmentalize
no, not
at that
yet.
scale. Yeah.
Yeah. um yeah, so that's kind of so he only just started with us like just maybe 3 weeks ago, I think. And
Hmm.
his first project was this big new feature for the IntelliSense plugin, and also kind of making a splash as making kind of branding it as an official thing, whereas before it was just this third party open source tool.
Hmm.
And since then, he's been helping me out with some of this Tailwind UI stuff for like the last week. So working on some new component design ideas and some of the things we need to build to make those possible. Because a sort of recurring theme of our work is Steve designs something. We realize that like to implement this in a way that we feel good delivering to customers in a way that's going to be easy for them to work with, we actually need to introduce some new tool or some new feature to the open source framework or something to
Oh,
simplify
interesting.
like the API that's exposed to them to work with.
So Steve is kind of driving changes in the underlying framework in order to like better express the thing that he's trying to do.
In some ways, like unknowingly to him, I guess. So
Yeah.
like one concrete example would be one of the kind of categories of components that we haven't built yet is what we're calling like content sections for marketing pages. So imagine like a landing page that has like sort of a section with a big story in it where there's going to be
Yep.
some paragraphs and headings and lists and stuff. Because of how Tailwind works, where it's very much like add a class to set the font size, another class to set the color, another class to set the margins. Trying to style like a big block of content is super inefficient and
Oh,
impractical
interesting.
because you don't want to go to every
Yeah,
p tag and add the same classes every single time.
that's
So
interesting. You get to a point where you kind of need a whole bundle together.
yeah, you need like how can we call this like a content block and just throw one class at the top of it that just makes sure that like H2s look good, paragraphs look good,
Ah,
lists look good.
interesting.
So we can't like ship that component to people right now because if people copy it and see there's like all these paragraphs, all this duplicated stuff, if they want to change the content, add a new list, change the headings, it's like, oh, I better find, was there another H3 that I can copy these classes from? It's just not a good experience.
Yeah.
So what me and Brad have been working on the last week is like, what can we invent that lets us expose a much simpler API to people where we can just have like right now the working class name is pros because we thought that sounded really classy. So we could just throw like a pros class on like a div and everything inside it's going to look nice. And we have to figure out, okay, well, what's the configuration API for this? Because some people are going to want to change the font size of things or change the color.
Interesting.
make the link color match their brand color. So what do we need to expose? What do we want to own and kind of hide? Because a lot of people don't want to. Most people using stuff like this are the sorts of people who are like, I've heard of the word vertical rhythm before, but I have no idea how to make like that look good. Can you please just
Dude,
own that for me?
this is so
Um,
fascinating. This is what you could technically call a scale transformation. It's where like you're doing a whole bunch of little things with certain primitives, and now you want to forget about the primitives and you want to sort of speak a higher language
yeah,
that kind of wraps all those primitives. And then you have all these trade-offs that appear because okay, like how do I'm giving up control in a way, but then I'm offering all of this leverage at a higher level.
yeah, and
It's
they're
really
like in
interesting.
conflict all the time, which
Yes.
is really hard.
Hmm.
Yeah,
Okay. So and then you said you have two more kind of like coming on board,
yeah.
and then in what
Um,
roles?
so development as well, and then we're going to be looking for someone to come on to help with design in the near term too.
I
So
see.
we went from like two super overwhelmed, drowning people for 2 years to
Yeah.
okay, let's try and speed things up a little bit, maybe in like a more aggressive way than intended. Like what actually happened is we we hired Brad, and then and before we hired Brad, we were actually working with bringing on a third partner, but we just couldn't come to terms that everyone felt comfortable with. And we expected that to work out at the time that we hired Brad, and then it didn't. So then we were like, we need to hire someone that we can kind of put in that role because we were planning to be 4 people. But in
Uh,
interviewing for that role, we found 2 people that we really liked. And we
uh-huh.
kind of figured out, okay, well, here's like the map of all the work we need to do. How can we like draw the borders here and to make it so that these 2 people fit? So that's kind of what happened there. So yeah, it'll be 3 developer employees plus me, the developer founder, then Steve, the design founder, and then I think Steve is going to become a bottleneck really fast, and
Yep.
and I think also would just really value having some another designer's input on things because right now like it's just me and him working on stuff, so I can give
Right.
feedback on the design stuff because I value design a lot and care about it a lot, but it's not the same as having another person whose design
Totally.
skills like you respect and want to be inspired by giving you
Yeah, totally.
feedback, right? So
Totally. Okay, so as you're going through all these changes now, and Shape Up comes into your mind as like maybe not just like the new thing from those Basecamp guys to read, but like something that might actually be applicable.
yeah,
Uh, is it more about there's something that's going wrong today in how we're working that we need to fix, or is it more about like I'm looking ahead and I'm trying to imagine like how we're going to function when we have all these people involved, and I'm kind of trying to prepare for that.
I think it's a bit of both. I think there's definitely up until now we've had our hands in so many different things at the same time all the time, and I can point to so many projects that we've kind of like got 60% of the way there on, but then something else more important came up and that kind of just stayed unfinished and we never got back to it.
Hmm.
um and it's been okay as a team of 2, like we've been able to like reprioritize and figure things out, but there's just like a lot of unfinished work sitting around.
Okay,
And
stupid question. Like
yeah,
what's bad about that?
I
Why
don't think
why
anything's like inherently bad about it, but it leads to a feeling for us sometimes of like looking back over the last 6 weeks and feeling like, what did we actually like put out into the world in this time?
uh,
Like nothing. It felt like we just like got halfway there on a bunch of stuff, but new, more important stuff kept coming up and taking its place at like the top of the list. Which,
I see.
in some ways, like I think you have to be able to adapt to that. You have to be able to take care of more important things when more important things come up. But my opinion right now at least is that that has to come with a balance of also it kind of ties into like what you guys talk about with like betting on things like let's just like give this project 2 weeks. If something more important comes up, like let's just be okay with the fact that if we don't start on it for another week, that's really not going to change things that much and we will have gotten this thing done at least then, you know what I mean? Like
Yeah, it's kind of like it's almost like this unfinished work actually effectively becomes scrap,
yeah,
because if it never is going to make it out, then it kind of becomes scrap, and then you have this sort of like, I don't know what the right term for it is, but it's this sort of ratio of like what's actually getting out the door versus what's sort of piling up somewhere
yeah,
for
yeah. And
for later.
I wouldn't say it's always scrap, but it does feel like that a lot of time, because it feels like if you come back to something like 2 months after you last touched it, it's really hard to just like pick up where you left off. It feels like you got to get back that
Yeah.
context, and a lot of the time getting back that context almost means like doing the work from scratch again to sort of like really appreciate how you got to where you
Oh,
were. And
interesting.
um yeah,
That's
so like
interesting.
even like Tailwind UI, the first version of that, we designed like we probably built the whole thing like 60% of the way there 3 times and threw it all out. Not because we didn't finish it, but because like we just learned things and needed to start again, you know?
Yeah.
And it feels like that is even more likely to happen with something that kind of rots in the background for a while. So there's that piece, like the just feeling like we want some more structure. We want to have some things on the calendar where even if we're not working in the most efficient way possible, we can like guarantee that like every 3 weeks something went out that is like a milestone of some kind. So we can look back on the year and feel like, yep, these are all the things we got done. Because I've definitely
Mm.
had years where there was a 6 month period where I didn't actually put anything out,
Uh-huh.
you know, and
Yep.
that's a crappy feeling.
Yeah, totally.
So then the other side of it is the just wanting to feel like the people that we're bringing onto the team are coming into a system and not coming into uh,
Uh-huh.
ad hoc figuring
I
things
get
out
it.
as we go.
Yeah, totally. Totally. So
Um,
like the in the short term, it's like I don't want to have that bad feeling again that like we didn't produce anything or we didn't ship anything.
yeah,
And then in the longer term, it's like I need to set some kind of I need to actually be able to tell people like this is how we work when I bring them in.
yeah, because I think, and I don't know this for sure, but I'm trying to put myself in the shoes of someone joining a new team. I think it's nice to feel like you know exactly what to do and like what's expected, and not just
Absolutely.
feel like, I think it's tempting for me as like a founder with a team to feel like, oh, people want like a lot of autonomy. They want to feel like, they're kind of like working on whatever's interesting. And I think some element of that makes sense, but I also think like if you're not careful, that can probably create a lot of anxiety in people around like, am I
Absolutely.
doing something that the people paying me want me to be doing, so trying to
I
balance like giving people well-defined, clear work, and also giving them the freedom to sort of execute it on it in a way that makes it rewarding and fulfilling for them. I think is something that is really kind of at the heart and soul of the shape up stuff as well. So yeah,
That's totally core because actually I think we're seeing so many uh, startups and actually also non-startups, but especially like younger companies, um, kind of over-indexing on some sort of a kind of a like a like a fuzzy sort of naive democratic thing. I don't know how to frame it exactly, but it's sort of this notion of like it's a well-intentioned idea of like I don't want to limit anybody and I also want kind of the maximum input from everybody, but actually what you get is sort of you get this sort of inability to act because people don't really know where the borders are and what the goal is and how to make trade-offs and stuff like that, and then you end up with basically like a lot of really long meetings with a lot of
yeah,
discussions. Is a lot of talking and not a lot of doing, and I think we are kind of shape up in a big way is about how do you how do you channel people's own ability to solve problems and contribute creative ideas, but how do you actually channel that by giving boundaries and direction, um, without over specifying it.
yeah. So that's definitely something that has been on my mind a lot lately, for sure, and hoping that this a way of thinking about things will hopefully help with that.
Okay, so I can imagine that it comes time to actually try and think about what it would mean to implement this or to actually do shape up. And I'm guessing it wasn't just like wave the magic wand and now everything is different, right? Like there's
Yeah,
probably some
yeah.
some
So
struggle and some misfit.
I can tell you like where the pieces that we kind of adopted first, and like where we kind of tried to start. And the one that has always stood out to me is like something that made a lot of sense to me as being really important is picking deadlines for things. Just like the
Yep.
fixed time. approach to things, which I think really helps with our like
Fixed time
first,
variable scope.
yeah, like our first problem that we kind of talked about, which is like feeling like things aren't getting done. I feel like if you don't give deadlines to things, like you're contributing to that problem. Whereas if we start throwing deadlines on things, well, maybe we can start kind of solving that problem.
Yeah.
So that's kind of how we started, was just figuring out, okay, like let's prioritize some projects and decide on a reasonable amount of time to give them. And I'm trying to be deliberate about actually like assigning way more time than I feel like is absolutely necessary for things, because I think it's
Hmm.
probably safer that way guarantee success in terms of like not having to push things back or something, right? So we'll even pick like Brad's first project, which was like the diagnostics linting feature for the IntelliSense plugin. He already had like a prototype of that built that he'd worked on in his spare time, which was great. Wasn't really ready for prime time, and of course, like the last 20% is like 80% of the work, sort of thing. So I think we gave him like a full week to kind of finish that off, which doesn't
Hmm.
sound like a lot, but when something's like most of the way there, it was actually a lot of time. And the way that we've kind of been doing this, which I think has been working well so far, is even when we give a project a week, it's not like a Monday to Friday week. It's like you have the full week Monday to Friday, and then we're going to launch it on like the Tuesday of the next week. So you have like the Monday to sort of wrap up any final sort of details, like finish up a little announcement blog post or whatever, put it out Tuesday morning, and then we use like the rest of that sort of launch week as like house cleaning, help people out with their stuff, kind of get like organized, and you don't start on like another project until like the next Monday. That's kind of been like the
Uh-huh.
way that we've been approaching it. It's sort of like the 6 week, like 2 week approach that you guys take, with like really compressed down. Um,
Like a
just because our
micro cooldown.
Yeah, exactly. So that's kind of how we've been doing that, and that's been working well so far. But again, we've only done it for 2 projects.
Hmm.
Um, and both of those projects were much more like Basecamp style projects, and the sort of, there's some design, there's some development. Both of them can sort of happen in tandem because they don't really depend on each other too much.
Hmm.
Um, like the IntelliSense thing, there's barely any design work for that. The only work that Steve had to contribute was helping to put together like a little marketing, like open graph image. You know what I mean? But even that was like a few hours of work to get right. But
Hmm.
that actually leads into like a discussion that we can have, but maybe not like right this second, around like, should Steve be allocated to that project if he's the designer and there is
Uh-huh.
design work
Yep.
needed, but there's certainly not a week of design work needed.
Yeah.
So that whole idea is like one of the biggest points of friction for us right now, and trying to figure out how to fit that into our process. And
Mm.
then the other project, we wanted to launch like a little micro blog for the company where we could post these announcements. Because we like having like these visible sort of like, if we can scroll through this blog post and see these dates, and we're making sure that every project has like a little post that goes with it, that's kind of like uh capturing like all the output that we had for the year. It's like there's
Yeah.
one like sort of central place to celebrate that stuff, which feels
It's funny.
important.
We went through the same process early on at Basecamp. When we first got into a rhythm of shipping new features for Basecamp Classic, like we're talking like 2000, I don't know, probably was 2005 or four or
Yeah,
something
yeah,
like this. We ended up writing a custom tool called Champagne. And the whole
yeah.
notion was to like celebrate new releases by being
Yeah,
able to publish them with some sort of a microblog thing. It was
yeah,
totally
that's
like,
awesome.
this is like a thing that must happen to everybody, you know?
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, so I mean, that worked well for both of those projects, but a lot of the work that we do is like work on this like Tailwind UI project, where Steve has to design like, say, 3 or 4 new like hero sections for landing pages, which
Yeah.
is going to take him a lot of time. And because unlike Basecamp, like the design team isn't also the front end development team, there's like a handoff that has to happen.
Hmm.
And until there's like something to hand off, there's not really anything for the developer on that project to do. So it leads to this question of like, how do we fit that into this approach? And a bunch of things come out of that in terms of like options in my head. One is like, do we take a project like that and actually split it into 2 projects with 2 separate deadlines? There's like the design kind of output, and then there's like the development output, which I know like probably like makes the hair stand up on the back of your neck working at Basecamp, where like you just like are so opposed to the throw it over the wall, like build the design thing. Um, where like the high fidelity design is not actually output. You know what I mean? I've heard it a million times, so I know exactly what you're thinking. But then the other approach is like, well, maybe
Well,
we just
I do have a framework to justify it though. I could twist myself into justifying it.
okay,
But we'll see if we need to go there or not.
okay. And then the other idea is like, well, what if we make sort of the people assigned to projects a little bit more flexible? So instead of like, this is a 2 week project, which really means it runs from like Monday to like the Tuesday, like a 2.5 weeks later. Like that's kind of like our version of a 2 week project. Instead of it being like, okay, Brad and Steve on that Monday are starting on this, and Brad is just kind of like twiddling his thumbs until Steve has something for him. Maybe like the project exists on its own as a thing with a 2 week deadline, and people kind of come in and out of it based on when they're kind of most needed. But coming up
Mm,
with like a system for that that feels structured is hard too. But then I have to wonder, how much structure do we actually need in that? Like, do we really need to like
yep.
micromanage people like little ants, or can we just trust that everyone is
Yep.
like a mature grown up person and they can see, well, yeah, this is coming up on the calendar in a week. I should check in with Steve and see if he's got enough for me to kind of hop in and start working on my part of this. And
Mm,
but if you're doing things that way, what are people doing in the time that they're not needed on the project? Does that mean that you have like projects that kind of overlap? And now things are getting complicated, right? Which I really hate the idea of people having to juggle things, you know?
yeah.
How can you be
Yeah.
efficient but also structured? I don't know. It's tough.
Yeah. Yeah. There's also like an interesting trade-off there because juggling when you have too much is really unpleasant. Um, and juggling when you actually have a lot of free space is pleasant because it actually means kind of like oh, like I'm sort of waiting on this. I have something else I can nibble at while I'm waiting on this. You know, so
Yeah.
there's very different kind of universe of that. We actually have uh, until you sort of described the situation, I didn't even appreciate this before, but we actually have a practice when we schedule so-called small batch projects for a 6 week cycle. We don't we might have, let's say, three different projects that we plan to happen in those 6 weeks, and we'll give that to one team that we'll call the small batch team, and it's like you're going to do these three things. And there's a sense in which each one of those individual three projects has a kind of appetite to it, which is like more or less, let's just say for simplicity, it was 2 weeks per project, which somehow totals to 6 weeks. The thing is that we're not actually saying after 2 weeks the first one will ship and then you'll start the next one, and then after those 2 weeks we're totally fine with allowing those to overlap during the 6 weeks. So there's this kind of like, it's funny, it almost reminds me of your prose problem of like uh, something that used to be really discrete is now getting like mixed together into a container.
Yeah.
But it's like we actually have this thing where like at the end of the 6 weeks we are sure that these things are going to ship, and given the cocktail of work that we've put in, um, we believe that it's none of this stuff is going to sort of, we're not going to be spending longer than we want to on any of these things. But there's also going to be kind of enough flexibility that the team can self-manage. Like, look, we don't care how you do it, but there's going to be some design needed for these things, and these things are a little more programming heavy. But if at the end of the 6 weeks these three projects ship, we kind of don't care about
Yeah.
um, sort of measuring our yield or whatever, you know what I mean, or like how the hours
Yeah.
were spent along the way.
So that's kind
That's
of
sort
like
of
it's like an interesting alternative to the what I imagine in my head as overlapping, which was more like, okay, well, this is like a 2 week design project, but Brad has been on like a 2 week project that actually ends right in the middle of this, whereas like ended like right before, because of the fact that maybe like Steve did his design stuff, and maybe Steve and Brad are like staggered the whole time. You know, it's like there's like the design week and then the build week,
yes,
and then the design for the next project is happening, and that's where
yes,
things start to feel like hard to
exactly. So
keep
this is
track of.
planned overlap is very different than self-organized overlap within a box, you know. And there's
Yeah.
this notion where like actually the more complex the timing is, the less you want to actually try and dictate it, and the more you want to create a wall around where that can sort of happen in a spontaneous way.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that makes sense, and that's not like something that I really considered. So I'm trying to think of like, it still seems tough because if everything depends on the design, then where do you create like the first set of walls? You know what I mean? Because it's no matter what, the beginning of that
Yeah.
is going to be design.
So here's another place I wanted to go. I want to ask you, I want to follow that design work upstream more. So
Yeah.
like, where does the idea first come that like Steve is going to start designing this thing? Like, how does that? Because I get that like you need to have the design before you can implement it, but
Mhm.
like, what, how do you get to like him working on that design in the
Sure.
first place?
Yeah. Yeah. So there's some just like founder level product strategy elements there, right? Which I think is up until now we've sort of been working through a predefined backlog. Like we sort of worked to identify like what do we think is a substantial sort of think of it as like a table of contents for this like components directory site. What are all the kind of important UI patterns we can identify? So we have a checklist to sort of work against, and we still have a few of those left, basically, because we released the product in sort of like an early access model. But we're starting to run out of that, and we still do discover new things that we didn't think of that we add. And a lot of this just comes out of just um, we'll notice something during our day to day on something, browsing Twitter, and we see someone link to a website, and we look at the website, and it's like, that's an interesting little thing. That's a component, and we didn't really think about that. What other stuff can we put in that category? And
Yeah,
me and Steve talk on the phone a couple times a week at least, and these things will just sort of come up, just sort of like a catch up. What are you thinking about lately? And historically, like we've worked together to sort of identify this stuff on some call at some point. And this is like pre us trying to implement any sort of scheduled work approach, right?
yeah,
So we would sit in Figma or whatever, pasting in screenshots from websites, kind of figuring out like, does this kind of fit here? Does this fit here? And then make a list of like, okay, well, if we had to build like 4 of these, like what could they sort of be? And just kind of describe them in words, So if it's like, say, feature sections for a landing page, we could say like, maybe it's like a 2x2 grid that has like the features, or maybe we can do like a zigzag thing where there's like a description and an image and then an image and a description, or maybe we can do like a stacked list. And we just sort of identify that stuff, and then he goes and starts tinkering with ideas for it, and then eventually he has them fully designed, and then I start building it. And now the interesting thing about this is like there's like a design phase that has to happen before the development, but in my experience the designer is still very much needed throughout the development process. Like
yeah.
it's never like fully handed off and then it's done. Like no matter how hard Steve works to think of every edge case in every
Yes.
situation, you
There's
always are
still
like,
opacity there.
you
Yeah,
missed like the focus state on this button here, and we don't have an
yep,
example of that. And I tried something, but it looks bad. And,
right.
so there's always collaboration that happens during the development process, but not necessarily during the design process. Like there's a little bit in terms of surfacing what are we going to make? What are like the rough ideas, like the shapes of these things. And then Steve kind of
Hmm.
goes and can fill those in. But something I've been wondering, which maybe is related to what you're talking about here, that I was going to ask is like, could we almost consider like some of the higher fidelity design stuff to be like the output of the shaping phase? You know what I mean?
So
Um,
that's where my head is going, and I'm wondering about that. And the thing that um, I don't know how far we can go in this format, but let's try. Like what I'm curious about is like from the initial conversation of like, hey, I think maybe we should have a component for X, right? To what you've called finished design, like this is ready to
sure.
go to
Yeah.
programmers.
Finished. Yeah.
Yeah, these are like words that we use, but we there's actually a lot of intermediate stages of the work
Yeah.
where the work goes from Bob's partner Greg has he's used this term with me before, from soft versus hard. Like the design is very soft in the beginning, like maybe it's going to be like this, maybe it's going to be like that, and then there's a point where it's totally hard, like it's all fixed hard points in the design. Like, is there a point before the design is finished where it's let's not use the word finished, but let's use the word like solved? Like,
Yeah.
where's that point in Steve's work where he's like, you know what, I'm not done, but I'm not worried anymore? Versus like there's that earlier part of like, I don't actually know um, what parts of this are like the
Yeah.
you
Yeah,
know what I mean?
that's
What are
definitely a
the
thing. Like, there is definitely a point where it's like, okay, I've landed on 3 ideas that, like, these are definitely the ones that I'm gonna take over the finish line. I definitely have them roughed out in a way that, like, most of the changes I'm gonna be making from this point forward are probably gonna be mostly superficial.
yeah.
Um,
So
I think
what I think what I'm imagining an opportunity is here, and then push back on me if it
yeah,
doesn't sound like it's fitting, is is actually I think what I imagine is happening is that Steve is taking something from 0 to like 95,
yeah,
right? And then handing it off. And what I imagine is that there's actually an intermediate point where he could say, you know what, I know what this is, and I believe this is doable now, but there's a whole bunch of dialing in that I still need to do. That line, whatever that point is, that's actually where shaping ends and production begins. And I think what's happening is there. It sounds like there isn't a differentiation for in his work right now between those two
yeah,
phases. And what could happen is if he actually played with stopping earlier and figuring out what does the fat marker equivalent of a component look like, where
yeah,
I believe in it, but there's still enough risk in it in the sense of like I've still got to work out some details, but like we actually want to schedule this now. Where's that point, you know? Because what could happen then is if he stops earlier, then actually the overlap will increase because there's more work that the programmers can start doing while he's still tuning the exact radius of the corner and the shade of blue and whether those
mhm.
two purples are similar or different enough, or you know what I mean?
Yeah, it's tricky because with the sort of work that we do, like, the type of programming for these projects is very much just, like, implement exactly what's in the design. There's not like a, "Well, I can sort of figure out the database schema for this while Steve is doing that," you know? It's all, like,
Uh,
hyper isolated to the front end,
mm,
and, the risk, I think, is with the way that these technologies work, like HTML and CSS, something that looks visually like a very minor change can actually be like a substantial architectural change in the markup,
yeah,
very frequently.
yeah,
Um, so it's hard to start on something and not have a high risk of like it almost like going to waste, you know, like I'll have to like rework that completely. Like, that
I
even
see,
still happens when we get like the 95% design
I
and
see.
then work together in the final phases of it, you know? Like you'll get something like totally finished and like actually this is like a perfect example. You'll get something that feels like totally finished, you build it all out, and then you think, what would happen if like that text had to wrap in this list? And now like the card next to it gets a little bit taller too. And now all the buttons have to get pushed to the bottom so that the buttons all stay aligned. But fuck, the whole way I built this
uh
means I have to group these things together instead of these things together for
I
those to be able,
see.
you know what I mean? Like that
No,
happens a
I
lot.
see. Now I understand better. Actually, this it doesn't map so well to what we do on like normal product. Like you were saying when you worked on the like microblog to announce features, to
Yeah.
announce new changes. Um, there's actually a level of abstraction that you just don't have because it's not about like if I click this button, then I get to this other screen, and it kind of doesn't matter like how we
Yeah.
exactly implement that. You're actually working lower in the weeds from the beginning because the work that you're doing is like down at that level. It's
Yeah.
like you're closer to the metal. I'm coming around. I think that your idea to actually like deliver a fully like spec high resolution pixel perfect thing and treat that as like the input for the bet. I actually think that's I'm with you on that. I think that's actually
Okay.
the way to go. Yeah, no hairs standing. I think that's actually um reasonable considering the fact that you are actually in a production line situation. There isn't like a higher level thing that
Yeah.
you're trying to get to that has degrees of freedom in it that you're going to try and like learn by building, you know?
Yeah.
I actually think the degrees of freedom aren't there. So you actually are in a more of a like a value add production stage, more of a
Mhm.
factory situation. I think you're in a different
Definitely.
environment
Yeah.
with that. Yeah.
Okay, so I agree with that, but then the thing that becomes tough is it feels like that pushes Steve's responsibilities into unstructured work land, which I don't think he'll be super excited about, because like for him, he's been totally into this idea of like, I feel like there's a lot more structure around what I'm doing now. I feel like I know I should be
Yep.
focused on this instead of kind of, experimenting with all these different things at the same time.
Yep.
So do you have any ideas on how we can make his side of things feel more structured? Because like, at least from my memory, going through Shape Up, the times that I've read it, and I haven't read it in the last probably month. I remember the shaping phase as being of this very, some things take 2 years to shape, some things take 2 weeks to
Yep.
shape. It's just kind of, I have
Yep.
this idea that's been rolling around in the back of my head, and sometimes a little piece of clarity shows up,
Yep.
and yeah,
I think I'm starting to see a suggestion here. So I think the first thing we talked about with I think there's an opportunity for him to just look at his process and make this differentiation between when was I getting to the point of like I think there's a component here and not just an idea for a component, and then his execution of that component to the fully designed version. I think that there is a shaping phase that's implicit in what he's already doing or what you're doing together. It might
sure,
also be what's happening between you, where you're
yeah,
kind of like, should this be a component? Is it possible to make this a component? Do we know how to, uh, can we set the boundaries on this? So this is a thing that you're going to go make and we believe it's going to happen, Um, I think actually what could happen is it might be possible to think of Steve as an independent team that he basically has his own cycles, more or
yeah,
less, and you actually make bets on his time for what is he going to ship, and shipping has a different definition for him. He ships to the input of a further cycle.
yeah,
We have a little bit of an analog to this in the sense that uh, our web teams um, lead all of the work on our products, and our mobile teams do actually follow that work because the core APIs are going to start from the web team because
okay,
we're designed around the so-called majestic monolith, David
yep,
calls it. You
yeah,
know, we we would not. This is not. I'm not claiming that this is the ultimate way everyone should do it, but we are organized around a hybrid model, which means that like there is a core, and that core is the web. Because we're organized in that way, a lot of the things that our mobile teams do is necessarily downstream. It's just got to be. So
yeah,
what's going to happen is the web team is going to prototype some new thing like Hey. When when
yep,
when Jonas and Jason were working on Hey, there was a web inbox first. And then there were a lot of core architectural decisions to make around like what is the inbox and like how does the screener relate to it and blah blah blah. Like there were these core things. Once those were figured out, for example, iOS and Android could implement native inboxes, but they actually, in a way, were taking the full spec of how the web version worked as an input to their process. And and
yeah,
and and this cycle was happening after some cycle had already finished from the web team. Um, we have dreams of, because of course, like we would love to have some things be more native first. We would love to have like more cross collaboration between those teams. But you know what? Like your org structure and your basic processes just rule you. So at the end of the
sure,
day, no matter what kind of collaboration we wish we could have, at the end of the day, because we're a majestic monolith, because we're hybrid at the core, mobile is going to be downstream from web in a lot of cases.
yeah,
And that's actually something that we kind of live with, and it seems to be all right. I'm seeing a parallel here.
yeah,
I
yeah.
think
No,
that
that's really interesting. Yeah, I see that as well. Do you
so I
find
think
like,
the key
yeah,
step
sorry, go
there
ahead.
is for Steve to make a transition to saying, where am I in the shaping point of like I never know if I'll finally have a way to think of this as a component versus like now I have an idea for a component, but I'm not going to start doing all the in the weeds work on this until we make a bet on it.
Yeah. Okay, so the things that I think are still, that I'm still trying to figure out in that model are, one, Steve is still needed during like the development cycle, right? His input is
Yes.
still needed during the development cycle. So
Yeah.
does that mean that we have to like schedule like a week project for him to do like these component designs, then like a week project to build them, but he kind of has to be on both? And he can't start the next design cycle until like after that development cycle is done because they need his input during that period. But now there's no development to do, not necessarily no development, but it means we have to shift off of the front end development component D type of projects and maybe find some open source stuff to do instead. But it creates this sort of like, out of every 3 week period, only one of those can be like actually building components. You see what I'm saying?
This is like so good. These are amazing questions. So I think what you're pointing out is that there's actually a whole art and science of betting that the book doesn't even begin to touch, which is uh, for just for example, like we have people who go on vacation. We know that they're on vacation before we make a bet for the next cycle. So there's this whole calculus of like, what skill are we lacking because this person is gone? And
Yeah.
then what type of work can we schedule because that skill is not available? So if it's like our super JavaScript person, then we're not going to do a super JavaScripty thing that cycle because they're gone. So there's already a whole puzzling aspect of betting that is not there in the sort of naive shape up presentation of it.
Yep.
But then further than that, there's also just the notion of reserved capacity. And so what I could imagine could happen is that you could have a cycle starting. I mean, so much of this is just about actually having that moment where you have this deliberate thought process where the cycle is starting and you say, okay, we have some components that Steve has finished designing that need implementation. And those are going to take some portion of Steve's time this next cycle. So then how much capacity do we want to reserve for that? Given that we've now reserved, let's say let's say it was 6 weeks, and let's say you said, you know what, let's assume that out of the whole soup of this 6 weeks, and we're not actually scheduling it in terms of sequence, we are allocating in terms of just sum, which
Sure.
is, you know, so let's say somehow out of this whole 6 weeks, let's say we reserve 2 weeks of capacity for Steve to play the supporting role of the unknowns that are going to come up in the implementation of the already designed components that are coming in as an input to the cycle.
Yep.
Then you could say, well, like, let's say that leaves 4 weeks of capacity for Steve to do other stuff. Then out of that 4 weeks, what's our appetite given the new stuff that he might want to design, and what is actually sort of ready in terms of being shaped, and what is sort of speculative in terms of I want to explore this to see if I can get to a component idea on this thing, right? And then you
Yep.
can deliberately, inside of that time box, you could deliberately say, look, we have 2 weeks of appetite for Steve to get to the sort of finish line of this pixel perfect ending point of his design phase on this one component, right?
Yeah.
And let's say that leaves more or less another sort of 2 weeks that's not accounted for. You could choose to bet that 2 weeks on the execution of another component idea that he's shaped but hasn't started yet.
Yep.
So this is kind of where this hill chart idea comes in. Like if he's got some sort of like he's done the shaping on some component, but now like let's take that downhill on for his work of that for 2 weeks. Or because you're so small, you could say, you know what, take that 2 weeks just for shaping, and let's use that time to figure out like what the next most valuable component could be, or to find an approach on some gnarly thing that we don't understand yet, or whatever. You have a lot of latitude, in sort of
Yeah.
what goes into that box that you bet.
That makes sense. I think the thing that I'm hearing there that I wasn't thinking before is that maybe our current approach of really small bets is less compatible with that, and we need to think about that. Like you're saying
Mm,
6 weeks, 6 weeks, 6 weeks, but like most of the stuff we're doing is like 1 week, 2 weeks, 1 week, 2 week, right? And if we do it
yes,
that way, we can't say, well, let's reserve like 78 minutes for Steve to do shaping during this 1 week cycle or whatever.
you're to use an unfair word for it. You're unintentionally micromanaging.
Yeah.
I think it can help for me when I think of the word micromanage, because I use it um, in my own mind very often. All it means is planning at the wrong scale,
Yeah.
and there's a scale at which it's just too small, and the errors accumulate too fast. You know, like if we're wrong about this 1 week, then like the next week is screwed up, and it's like there's no way, there's no shuffling between them. Versus when we plan at like more or less 6 week level, even if we're only doing 1 week long things, we can put them into a soup where they can slide around each other according to the dictates of the unknowns.
Yeah.
And then the at the end of the 6 weeks, we can be more confident that somehow this stuff will all get done, even though we couldn't have anticipated what got worked
Yeah.
on Wednesday and what got worked on Monday.
It feels like I have this like internal discomfort with that for some reason that I think is because it feels like risky to me to bundle everything together into a 6 week thing and then find ourselves in the last week realizing that there's still a week of stuff to do on each thing. You know what I mean? And now how do we prioritize what to get done and what to not get done? Whereas if we said like, yeah, for this 2 week period, we're going to build out these content sections, components, and then that's it. We don't have to worry about like making sure that we're not forgetting to move these other boulders a little bit up the hill as well.
Yep.
I guess it reminds me of that like doing too much at the same time world that we're coming from, where it felt like um, there wasn't like deadlines on everything to guarantee that they got done. Like there's still a deadline, but it feels like the thing I like about how we've done it so far, even though there's issues with it, of course, which is why we're doing this
Yeah.
conversation, is that
Yeah.
I feel very like sure that everything's always going to get released on like the
Uh,
days that we're assigning it to be released. And I'm trying to
yeah.
figure out how can I maintain that certainty when we're trying to do a lot of things at once.
Yeah, totally. So, a couple thoughts on that. First of all, I just think that I just first want to like say that I really like how you articulated that, and I really understand that feeling of like I get that, you know, because there is a trade-off that we make with self-management, and basically we are kind of constructing on purpose a chaotic box, because sometimes actually the chaos is the way that we get the order we need. This is very counterintuitive, but it's totally true. And this is like something Jason and David are masters of that I've tried to learn to articulate in this whole model, you know. um, the whole notion of like, don't assign anybody any tickets and just give them the shaped pitch and then leave them alone for 6 weeks is exactly this kind of a trade-off. It has a similar feeling of like, I'm giving up control, but actually they need these degrees of freedom in order to solve it, and win.
Sure.
So I think this is just like hugely important just to even sort of like feel that and acknowledge it. um, two observations come in that might be helpful. The first one is uh, part of it I think is about easing into it. So it might be that you schedule two things that overlap in a slightly longer time box, and you're not going straight to like 6 weeks with four projects happening inside of the 6 weeks, just so that you can step your way into it. The other thing that I'm picking up a little bit, and just tell me immediately, I might be totally wrong, but I'm picking up a little bit of this um, very common mindset that we all have, which is like, I have uncertainty, and so my way to solve the uncertainty is to pad.
Okay.
Like, and this is actually, I think, wrong. I think this doesn't work, because what it does is it doesn't actually engage with the uncertainty and get it doesn't. It's like there's a swamp, and it's like, instead of going in the swamp, I'm just going to put on like heavier rubber gloves. And what we're always doing is we're actually trying to get in the swamp and figure out how to wrangle that uncertainty more. And so I think there's an opportunity to say like, we don't know how long it's going to take, and then sometimes we get surprised and then we run out of time, and so let's add extra time. Instead of that, what I think what we try to do is we put a lot of effort into what we call sequencing. So
Okay.
we're having much more I don't know the right word for this. Like, the word that came to my mind is aggressive. And what I
Yeah.
mean is
Yeah.
like, I want to interrogate the work. Like the work that I'm biting off right now, I want to really challenge it and pull it apart into little, like, it's sort of like factoring when you're coding.
Yeah,
I want to really like insist on like single responsibility principle. Like, that's, the difference when you work with programmers who do that and ones who don't. Like,
sure.
all of us, I think, have an opportunity to do that more with the work. And so, like, in the first week of what we're doing, are we actually kind of looking at the interdependencies and picking that first thing that has the most unknowns in it? Are we really doing that or not? And if we keep doing that, what we're going to find is that all the stuff that's left at the end when we're starting to run out of time are all screw tightening things, and they're not those kind of like, oh shit things that we're like, oh, we're going to need another week and we
Yeah.
didn't know it. My that's my sort of gut sense is to lean more into that sequencing work, to get to a point where you feel more confident that if you say like, we're only going to spend 3 weeks on this, and inside of a 6 weeks box the team knows that this is only worth 3 weeks, that they are going to internalize slowly, but they're going to internalize this slightly aggressive stance toward the dependencies in the work, and they're going to be more productive inside of that variable scope.
I think that makes a lot of sense for much more cohesive work, I think. But where it falls apart for us is that to fill 6 weeks, we're gonna have very unrelated things happening during those 6 weeks. Like we
Mm-hmm.
might be, let's design and build some content sections for Tailwind UI. Let's also implement like a dark mode feature in the Tailwind CSS open source CSS
So
framework.
that's by design. So I might be overstepping because I have so little context, but I think the opportunity there is that, like, if if um, if all of these pieces of work are actually very different, it means that they can move forward at different speeds according to when Steve is available.
I think that's true, but I guess my fear, and I could be wrong, is that when this dark mode feature, for example, which we could probably do as like a 3 week project, gets stuck into
Yeah,
like a 6 week box, all
yeah,
of a sudden there's this feeling of like, we still have to figure this out, but like we still have like 4 more weeks. And then like you end up with like 1 week left at the end, and a lot of things are in that same state where it felt like
yeah.
we
This is what I'm talking
procrastinated.
about. This is what I'm failing to articulate about the sequencing. If the team internalizes this sense of urgency about getting over the hill,
Yeah.
what the team what our teams do with the small batch projects is they've got, like, let's say 3 projects that are totally unrelated,
Yeah.
in a big box. They very aggressively get the biggest unknowns of all 3 over the hill first.
So how do you do that, like, in terms of picking which one to start on and when to stop? Like, if you hit, like, a gnarly problem in one and you feel like, "Ah, I don't know what I could do on this right now, and I think I just need to, like, give it a couple long walks outside before, like, a
uh
solution comes to it, and I'm gonna
yeah.
switch to the other thing that I think I can try and push that boulder up the hill a little bit further." Like,
Hmm.
how do you avoid that risk of not actually getting everything over the hill early enough in that way, you
Yeah,
know what I mean? Like, do
yeah.
you just say like, I'm not taking a breath of clean fresh air until this is like over the hill because that it's there's too much risk that I'm not going to come back to it.
I think we're coming to another missing piece of the puzzle here, which
Okay.
is, it's what it sounds like is, uh, it sounds like maybe there isn't enough shaping on the technical implementation work before the bet gets made. Because here's the thing: if we actually shouldn't be going into a project with like, I have no idea how I'm going to implement this.
Yeah.
We should, before we make the bet, we should actually have the tent poles of the implementation already clear.
But there's still an uphill phase though, right? Like where
There's an
there's
uphill phase,
unknowns.
but the unknowns, the purpose of the shaping work is to shrink those uphill unknowns to being minor ones.
Mhm.
So there's going to be a whole bunch of little unknowns, but they should all feel, technically we would say thin-tailed instead of fat-tailed variables. We
Okay.
would say
Yeah.
like, every one of these unknowns is an unknown, but it's an unknown that has a certain character to its probability distribution. It's not a killer unknown.
Yeah.
It's just an unknown. But all of those are bounded by the shaping work that we did, where we said, look, like it's gonna be like this, and those three things are gonna come together, and that's the core idea here, and we believe that's doable. So what I think is going to happen is the more you actually de-risk the implementation work by doing a little bit more shaping with the programmers before the bet is made, you're going to find that the work is going to feel like its overall character is a little bit more downhill. There's still always going to be those unknowns, but they're not going to be these big discovery, how the heck am I going to do this kind of things? And then allowing these things to slot and slide over each other is going to feel much more trivial.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually related to another question that I had for you, which is just around like the difference in the amount of shaping that different projects might have, and where some projects feel like 90% of the work is the shaping. I don't know if you've experienced that with stuff you do at Basecamp, but like
there's been some
this,
where like getting to the idea is all the hard work, and then once you actually have the aha of like the key moving parts, then the implementation is pretty trivial.
it's almost just it's a decision. Like the project is a decision in a lot of ways. Like a very concrete example is something we're literally working on right now, which is that Pros plugin again. But the biggest challenge with that project is figuring out like what do we expose in terms of letting people customize like these typography styles.
Mm-hmm.
So kind of the TLDR for like what we plan to ship as like the user experience is this plugin that adds a few classes to the framework, like Pros, that is just going to, you throw it on some markdown content essentially and it looks nice, but also like Pros-LG, where if you wanted like a 20 pixel base font size, you know, like you read a lot of articles online where there's lots of different ways you might do this, like a documentation site where like the documentation is like part of the whole UI. Maybe like 16 pixels is like the right base size for that. But you're
Uh-huh.
reading like a New York Times article, maybe it's like 24 because it's really supposed
Yeah.
to be like this central experience, right? So you want to give
Yeah.
people a few of these like modifiers. But now what if someone wants to add like another size that we don't offer? Or what if they want to customize one of the sizes? And
Yep.
if they customize like the font size for a heading, well, now they need to be able to customize the margins above and below the headings.
Yep.
And now they need to, what if like they want the margin between an H2 followed directly by an H3 to be different than an H2 followed by a paragraph? You
Yep.
like very quickly approach like CSS is like the customization language, but it's like,
Uh-huh.
we have to resist that because now we're
Yep.
not doing enough to help people. We want to,
Right.
how do we prevent it from getting to CSS while still being useful? And that is
Yes.
the hardest part of the whole project, is figuring out what is the public API for this plugin.
Yep.
And that feels like shaping work in a lot
It
of
is.
sense.
Yep.
But how do I, yeah, I mean, when does that shaping work happen? It feels like I need to put a 2-week block on the calendar where like my project is the shaping of this project. You know what I mean?
Yeah, so that's a great question. When you are at the size that you are, there's no other way to actually do that deep shaping work unless you reserve capacity for it. We at our scale now have a dedicated shaping track because we have so many people that we kind of have people who are full-time building and full-time shaping. We didn't have that until after many years. That's absolutely a scale thing. So when you can just go meta on this and say, what's my appetite for coming to a conclusion about whether or not I can shape this or not?
Yeah.
So like, am I comfortable risking whatever 4 weeks on coming to a yes or no answer of like, do I have a solution for this thing or not yet? Right.
Yeah.
And then you make that bet, you put that 4 weeks at risk. And then at the end of that, you either come out with a shape or you come out with a conclusion of like, this problem is I'm missing an insight that I don't have. And I could sit around for week after week and not have the insight. And then,
Yeah.
so what I like to do is if I believe that this is something important and I believe it's solvable, but I just have to focus on it, I will allocate that time and say like, I am going to only work on this shaping problem for the next cycle. But then what happens is if I get to the end of that appetite, I can't just think about this one problem forever. So
No.
I'm gonna say, like I did everything I could to understand the problem. I still couldn't crack the nut. I'm gonna wait until I have a eureka in the shower, and
Yeah.
that might happen a year from now,
Yeah.
right? But when that eureka comes, all of a sudden it's gonna be like, ding!
Yeah. Okay. So
Now we
related to
know what to
that.
do. You know?
Yeah. So that's interesting because like that was in some ways my plan for this project in a sense. Like I know that this
Hmm.
particular project, if we knew exactly what we were gonna do, it's like a 2-day thing, maybe at most. It's like
Yeah.
not much
Yep.
work. The most
Yep.
of the work is in writing the documentation that tells people how it works. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So, but we allocated like a full 2-week cycle to it, like which is like a 2 weeks plus 2 days. The way that we're kind of building in these like cooldowns right now, which maybe we should change exactly how that works if we're gonna
Hmm.
bubble things up to like a bigger scale and bundle in more small batch work. Um, but in this case, because I know that like you could basically say that like this project that I put on the calendar is the shaping project for this like pros plugin,
Yes.
you know? And
Yes.
but the reality is if we come to a conclusion about what to do and there's 2 days left, we can build it. You know what I
Yep.
mean?
Yeah.
Um, so doesn't that in some ways become like contrary to the idea of like shaping before you work sometimes, because it's like now we've created a project that has shaping and the work in one. I recognize that in general, for bigger things, probably what you're doing here is introducing a hell of a lot of risk. You know what I mean? Because like now you're whereas you might have just bet like 2 weeks to shape it, and then if you came to a conclusion, bet 4 weeks to build it. Now you're betting 2 weeks to shape and build it, where those 4 weeks at the end are sort of hanging on like, well, if we don't end up being able to shape it in the 6 weeks, well, we lost the whole 6 weeks instead of the 2 weeks that we bet on the shaping process. You know what I mean? I don't know where I'm going with this other than to say
Yeah.
like,
Let me say it like this. I
yeah,
think the deeper point of all this stuff is that work work has different phases, and these different phases of shaping and building have very different risk profiles. They have totally different, um, yeah, risk character. Shaping is extremely fat-tailed, and the thing that you think you might want to do could be really, really hard, or it could come together immediately. And we don't want to make an expectation that we're going to successfully build something unless we've kind of thin-tailed the variable. And then we have this feeling, and we know that it's thin-tailed when we have this feeling inside of like, I'm not worried. Like,
sure.
if
Yeah.
I had to go and sit down and just crank this tonight, like I could do it because I know what to do. As
Yeah.
opposed to like I would have to sit there and
It's
dream
like,
for and
sure.
go on long walks for 3 days.
Yeah. Yeah.
Like no long walks. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like, um, I mean, unexpected things come up, but like fundamentally, no, right? So the
Yeah.
thing is that um, we it's all about our expectation. So we never want to say, I'm going to shape and I'm going to build as one bet, because the way that probabilities multiply, if you have a fat-tailed variable and a thin-tailed variable, what's the product? The product is
A
fat-tailed.
really fat-tailed variable. Yeah.
It's
Yeah.
as fat-tailed as the most fat-tailed part.
Yeah, at a minimum. Yeah.
So what it means is that we always want to seal off the shaping risk from the building risk, and we only want to bet on stuff that we actually have gotten through that shaping process, because we can actually make the commitment to ourselves that this thing is going to ship. So the commitment to ourselves, if we allocate time to shape, is not that this is going to get bet. Like you might have this really nice property that like you get to ship it 2 days later if you're so lucky that you succeed in shaping it, you know.
Yeah.
But that's luck. That's not the bet. The bet is I'm willing to risk this number of weeks on shaping it to see if I can get to a solution or not. And then like truly you actually have a separate bet to make that would only be 2 days worth of work after, but it is an independent separate thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make
Okay.
sense?
Yeah, that totally makes sense. And I can totally see how on especially on most projects, the value proposition is even more clear than it is for like this one specific example. You know what I mean? This is almost like the most extreme example of it that I can think
Yep.
of for our own work.
Yeah.
So I think that makes sense. And I think what I'm happy with at least is that I feel like I'm getting permission to sort of do what we've done, at least in a sense. You
Uh-huh.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Where it's like, because I was going into this sort of thinking like, this does feel like the hard part of this is all this shaping, but when am I going to give myself the time to do that unless I put it on the calendar? And
Yeah.
half of the shaping work is prototyping it to learn, like, does this idea even work? And then
Yes.
once I know that the prototype works, there's like no difference between the working prototype and the finished product
Yep.
in this type of project, you know?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Um, so yeah, so it feels like at least what we've done there is okay and allowed. But I do have two more questions for you, I guess, if you have time,
Yeah,
which
sure.
is one is related to that, just general idea of like allocating shaping time on a small team.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because there's even some projects like the project that Brad started on, he knew way more about than me, right? He's sort of like the
Mm-hmm.
expert in that area. So in a lot of ways, like we should collaborate in figuring out exactly like what we want it to be, but like it needs more of his input than mine. And that means like he probably needs to be given time to like figure that out before like we put it on the calendar. But
Yeah.
we all are also doing the work.
Yep.
Um, so if you have like, and if you bring this back to the me and Steve sitting in Figma, throwing screenshots on the page to figure out what components fit into what categories, what we should build next, like that sort of shaping work too. Like, you know, just figuring out what opportunities are out there and what we should be working on. Like fitting that in a structured way, I guess, is something I'd like your advice on, because there's the easy version of that, which is just like, well, every 2 weeks on Wednesday afternoon, like we sit on a call and talk through like ideas we've had and play with some that we're both excited about and see what
Yeah.
direction we're in. But I wonder if you have more insight into that and in terms of like how you've done it and what way you think works best for making time for that sort of stuff.
Yeah. So I think this absolutely maps back to, first of all, we have to put it in context of scale. When when you reach a certain scale, everything can get crystallized into 6 weeks, 2 weeks, 6 weeks, 2 weeks, and you do this and I do that. Like, but before you reach that scale, you can't regularly schedule a certain number of weeks to do shaping because um, you need to use your time in a how do I say this? Like the when you're small, like this 2 weeks is different than that 1 week. You know what I mean? Like this week is different than next week. Like so many things are moving and changing and happening. And it's like it's a very different environment when you're small. And so I think the thing to work on is less about the schedule, is less about like a repeating schedule, because that is a larger scale structure and you aren't at that scale yet for repetition. The thing that you want, that you can hone, is uh, you uh, you can refine your sort of Geiger counter for this risk. So what you want to do is you want to have like any random project that comes up in front of you, and you want to be able to hold up your Geiger counter to it, and it goes like tick 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 tick, and you're like, up, this is not shaped enough.
Okay.
And what you want to do, I think, is you want to be we have this term from the like complex system science. We say patchy.
Okay.
Like you don't want to be black or white. You want to be like a little patch here and then a different patch here and then a different, because that's how life is. It's not when you become larger scale, you become more like a crystal where it's like ding ding ding, everything the same size. But when you're small, it's more like weird patches that you have to customize to what you're trying to do with who you have and the time pressure and the urgency and all this stuff. So if you have the Geiger counter, then what you can do is you can say, this thing that we're about to take on is setting off the not shaped enough alert. Now let's just use our cause and effect. If if we start working on this thing, it's going to become one of those things that gets 60% done, and then gets set aside because it turned out to be a little bit gnarlier than we thought. We didn't get done inside the appetite, and then we had to move on to something else because of availability of people. And we don't want that to happen. So what do we do to not let that happen? When something appears as not shaped enough, and we're aware of that, we've trained our awareness of that, and it's also valuable. Now we need to make a special case and allocate time to do that shaping work, right?
Yeah.
So it becomes a little bit more like a Tetris kind of a thing. Of you're fitting together different chunks of work of different sizes, but you're very conscious of what's shaped and what's not, and then what's my risk level if I kind of um, you know allow somebody to, like, this is what they're working on next.
Yeah.
It's developing that sense, and it's going to be more chaotic in the beginning, but because you have the Geiger counter, you're going to be able to make um, a lot of custom but wise decisions, you know. And then as you grow, when once you grow to have more people, then depending on how you kind of design your growth in terms of your org structure,
Yeah.
you can design yourself into a way where your org has constant reserved capacity for these functions all the time.
Yeah.
That's what we have, right?
Yeah.
But until you can afford all of that reserved capacity, you have to interleave it. And the way to interleave it is to constantly make those judgment calls about what's shaped and what's not. And then what are we going to work on next?
So how does that fit in with like this idea of trying to move towards like grouped small batch work with like the uh, bigger boundaries? If we're
Man,
making these like little small bets like placed after each other, you know?
yeah, you're asking like amazing, really good, hard questions. So the this is I'm just learning how to spell this out. Okay, I think I understand it, but I'm just learning how to try and articulate it. What I believe that when we cannot see when we cannot see the exact interdependencies of when are we going to need some design help on this particular programming project, when we have opacity and we can't see that, then we can't plan it. So if we can't plan it, the alternative of planning is time boxed soup. And I don't
Okay.
have better words for this yet. Like when I can't predict, like today and then the next day and the next day, I need to just mix them together into a container and say, but I believe that they can all happen in this box? Yes. Sometimes the answer is no, right? But if the answer is yes, then I can use this as a technique. Um, this is actually a scale transformation also. This is there's some rigor behind this, but I haven't learned how to spell it out completely yet.
Yeah.
It's that if I try to control the things at the fine scale, I don't have enough flexibility to deal with the unexpected. That doesn't mean that I just have no plan at all, because I might understand enough about the nature of the unknowns that that if I box them into this slightly bigger box, now I'm talking about this one box instead of five small boxes, right? That's what a scale transformation is. I'm talking about one bigger thing that has different rules than a bunch of small things.
Yeah.
This bigger box, it has different degrees of freedom in it. The people can say, "Oh, not today, but tomorrow." They can say that to each other, and they can customize the way that they schedule with each other inside of that box. But the box still gives them this pressure where they're like, yeah, but it's if it's not today, it actually has to be tomorrow. And it's like, okay, I can do it tomorrow. You know what
Yeah.
I mean? It
Yeah.
can't just be next week, right?
Yeah.
That's a thing that is not easy maybe to get an intuition about, but it's a very powerful trick. It's a way that we handle unknowns at a small scale by bounding them in a larger scale.
Yeah. I think like the thing about that whole concept that is most intriguing to me right now, or that I'm linking to like a concern of my own, is in some ways it feels like when we take these like 1 and 2 week projects and we kind of stack them after each other, and we always kind of have this like 2 or 3 days after each one to kind of like get reorganized before we start on the next one.
Hmm.
At a grand scale, it feels like very inefficient sometimes, because it feels
Hmm.
like the metaphor that's like coming in my head is like, imagine you have like a bunch of spheres that are like the size of a fist, and you're kind of like sticking them all in a big bucket. The amount of like volume of each one added
The amount
together
of
is
empty
less
space.
than if you just put like one big sphere and counted the volume of that whole sphere, rather than like the combined small ones, because there's all these gaps between them, right? So it feels
Mm-hmm.
like in a lot of ways it'll be more efficient, because like you can do 2 2 week projects in 4 weeks when you call it 4 weeks, but we can't do 2 2 week projects in 4 weeks when we call them 2 2 week projects, if that makes sense, because we're trying
That
to
is
push this.
exactly why we do it. Because we get more efficiency from the self-organization than from the planned version.
Yeah.
That's exactly what it is. Because for two people to say, actually, this thing I'm working on today is taking longer than I thought. I'm going to stay in my groove this afternoon, and let's push that other thing off 2 days.
Hmm.
That is more efficient, because it's allowing for the information that's arising from the unknowns to be addressed in the scheduling. The
Yeah.
scheduling is getting customized according to the discovered information that's coming out of what was formerly opaque.
So the only fear that I still have, which we talked a little bit about before, but I have another question related to it, is just this risk of being at like the last day of the cycle and thinking you just have a couple loose ends to wrap up, but each
Yep.
one takes a little bit longer than you think. And that would have been no problem if it was like it already feels to us, and I don't know if this is true at Basecamp, but like the last day or two of like a cycle feels like a little bit more crunch time-ish still. Like it's not like people are
Yep.
working overtime or doing anything crazy like that, but it is kind of like, okay, like there's these things on the checklist. Like you're a little bit more focused and a little bit more um things are a little bit more urgent, if that makes
Yep.
sense.
Yep.
And I worry that when you have that feeling for like the last 4 items on 5 checklists instead of 1 checklist, that you're still going to leave it all to one day and find yourself like, this is actually not doable now. Like, I guess the other question, or the other way of thinking about this question is there a risk that when you're batching all these projects together, that none of them get like that bow tied on top of them until the very last day, because they don't
Mm-mm.
need to have
No.
the bow tied on until the very last day?
So this is we're at grad level shape up here. This is the subject. We're in like a deeper level with this question, and the answer is really like this is what hill charts are for. So what you want to imagine is that you've got let's say you have a cycle with 4 projects in the cycle that are all more or less small appetites, 1 2 week projects, but there's no scheduling for how they get done inside of the 6 weeks.
Yeah.
What you're going to have is you're going to have four separate hill charts,
Yep.
and each hill chart um, is going to show you your risk of having last minute chaos. And what you do not want to see is you do not want to be in week 4 of 6, and all 4 hill charts have important scopes on the uphill slope.
I'm not even talking about that though. I'm talking about things like the very last day we're going to write up like a little announcement blog post for like the new feature, and Steve has to design like a marketing card, and like we think that's going to take him 15 minutes, but then it takes like 3 hours because we just can't find like the right way to present this thing visually in this tiny little
Uh
Twitter card. You know what I
yeah,
mean?
yeah.
Those
Okay, well
things
for
just
that,
all expand a little bit more than we expect. Um,
okay, 2 answers to that. First of all, there's a question of whether or not that should be bundled into the cycle or not.
okay.
So I would much prefer to extend your cooldown time and reserve capacity and cooldown for stuff like that, like marketing the stuff that got built. And that way
Yeah.
you can narrow the cycle time to just the building of the actual thing. That's the first thing. Second thing is even if you did continue to include it in the cycle, um, I think very often what happens is we actually if we're not very rigorous, or rigorous isn't the word. If we're not very I want a word stronger than disciplined about using the hill chart. Um, Even create the marketing, put the card on the marketing site should actually be a scope that starts at the bottom of the hill to reflect our uncertainty about it.
Mm.
And very often what happens is we kind of tell ourselves that's a known, and we kind of don't even consider to track it in that way.
Yeah.
And we in general take an extremely conservative stance toward every single scope of work, which is that uh,
I treat
it's
everything as high risk by default. Like,
everything is unknown.
yeah.
Everything is unknown, and it's only a question of if it's a thin-tailed unknown or a fat-tailed unknown, but it's all unknown, you know. And the basic intuition difference is like, look, if we if we had to, if somebody put a gun to our head and we had to release this marketing card tonight, like we could manage somehow,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yep.
that's versus if you can't necessarily say that about the pros problem. You know what I
No.
mean? Like it's
Yeah.
like, no, you can't. I don't care how much time pressure you put on me. Like I need to
Yeah.
have the eureka to get there,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
That's the fundamental difference. But in both cases, there's an uphill. And if we're really declarative about the uphill part, then this is communicating to everybody, hey, this could actually take 3 hours. You know?
So even still, I still wonder, like, given like a, call it like a 4-week cycle or something, so it feels like a little more on our scale or something that we're bundling
Okay.
like 3 things into. Um, does it make sense that, like, say the 4 projects that are stuck in there, or the 3 projects that are stuck in there, all of them don't get finished until the last week? You know what I mean? The last 3 days of the last week? Or does it make sense sometimes, and not even does it make sense, but is there like pressures in the system that will encourage people to, like, if you've only got like 4 hours of work left on this thing, and everything is over the hill on every project, say, right? And
Hmm.
all I have to, I'm not launching this for 2 more weeks, but literally all I have to do is write this little blog post and make this Twitter card. Should I
Yeah.
just do that now? Because like I think that intuition is like, that's like so straightforward that I should go do some of the other little bit more uh complicated stuff, even if it is mostly figured out. But it just means that, like, there's always a little bit of everything that's left till the very end, instead of being able to just cross it off the list and be like, okay, now I've only got 2 out of the 3 projects for this cycle left. And that one I literally don't have to think about it all anymore. Like, does that
Yeah.
happen at Basecamp or not? And what is your thinking around that?
I personally would err on the side of uh, if I would err on the side of like knock it out and get it done, because it feels great. It feels great to finish something, and you get a little bit of a, do you know this like energy push that you get when you finish, and you get this
Yeah.
like little like boost of like all of a sudden there's a little more gas in the tank for the next thing because you don't feel like you have so much on your shoulders at the same time.
Yeah.
Um, I think that is something that can be um, that's a good cultural value to be like we prefer to not have inventory, and
Yes.
inventory kind of smells. And so then if you're inside of this let's say 4-week cycle, like you said, and then inside of that box, it's not just chaos, it's values and practices, so like we're using the hill chart, we're prioritizing our unknowns, but we also have a value that we always prefer to ship as soon as possible, right?
Yeah.
So if I really think that I'm 2 days away from something, and I'm not trying to play Tetris with someone else's availability, you know, like err on the side of just knocking that thing out.
Yeah, okay. That's what I was hoping there was a way to make it work that way, because like the other
Yeah,
element of that is like, forget like a team productivity perspective, just from like a pure marketing perspective, plus like a morale kind of perspective. When you finish something, you want to be able to like celebrate that in public, like right away
totally,
while it's fresh, right?
totally.
And if everything's getting done at the end of the cycle, we can't
Yeah,
realistically say, okay, we've launched 5 new things today. Like, that's just bad from a marketing perspective. It's better if
absolutely,
maybe we're quiet for 3 weeks, but then like 2 things come out like 2 weeks before the cycle is over. Then like another thing comes out the
absolutely.
next week. And
No, I understand better where you're coming from. I took it for granted, and in the future I would actually spell out more carefully that we don't want to ship everything all at once at the end. The fact that we allocate this 4 weeks for all these things to happen is just giving us optionality. It's just giving us wiggle room to deal with the unknowns in the scheduling of these
Yeah.
people. But we still absolutely prefer in every chance to ship as early as possible. Absolutely. That's
Yeah.
the best place to be. And we
Cool, man.
take
Well,
advantage of that as much as we can.
I think that basically answers a lot of my questions. Like for me, the big takeaways for me again is this like bundling of work for multiple reasons. One, to increase efficiency because now you're not baking in unnecessary sort of break time, I guess. Not that we don't want people to have
Hmm.
like freedom to work on stuff, but it solves a lot of other problems that I was trying to solve in other ways, which was like
Hmm.
we gave this sort of break time at the end of each project because we wanted to make sure we had built-in capacity for like Steve to help someone with the one design element of what is otherwise like a programmy project, or I
Yep.
wanted to be able to pull in Brad to like pair with me on my project when I'm working on something kind of nasty. But if we kind
Hmm.
of bundle that all together, where we're as a team responsible for like a shared set of multiple sort of projects, whether they're related or not, it's easier for me to just talk to Brad and be like, "Hey, Brad, let's pair on this like tomorrow because there's like a really nasty thing and see how far we get with it. See if we can get this piece over the hill, and
Exactly.
then let's pair on like this other part of this other thing, and then we'll come back to this kind of once we got all that figured out." And you don't have to build in as much of these like break times because you just have
Yes.
that controlled chaos, like you're sort of talking about.
Yes.
Um, that plus this idea of just because something is given 6 weeks doesn't mean it has to take 6 weeks. Like I think like there was a thing that happened when I was at the workshop in Chicago where someone asked this question. They were like, "What happens if the work gets done in sooner than 6 weeks?" And David was sitting at like the very back of the room, like up in a chair, and he just kind of shouted from there. He's like, "That never happens," which so that's kind
it
of been
well
baked into like part of this like
it
uh
here's the distinction though.
that's a big batch project,
It
but
exactly. It
yeah.
happens all the time on small batch, and it never happens on a big batch. Exactly. Right. And this we've never really taken I didn't try to really explain all these nuances of small batch, and I didn't appreciate when I was writing Shape Up how relevant this sort of small batchy world is
Yeah, you need
to
like a whole
small teams, to
yeah.
very small uh yeah. So this has been hugely valuable for me. I've learned a ton from this
Yeah, I mean,
from digging
I
into this.
yeah, I'm super excited about like my takeaways from this for sure. So, again, that's basically like all the stuff that I was trying to figure out, and I think like we've been going for a bit over an hour and a half now, which I think is a good probably amount of time
Yep,
for this.
totally.
So dude, thank you so much. I'm sure tomorrow when we go to put it into well, Monday when we go to put it into practice, I'll realize I have no idea what I'm doing again, and maybe I'll send you another
I feel
but right now I feel great. So thanks so much for taking the time to do this. Hopefully other people found this valuable. I think this was like, I mean, from my perspective, this has got to be like a one of the most interesting like deep dives into this that's been shared publicly that I've experienced.
awesome.
So
I can't wait to share it.
yeah, dude,
I think other people are gonna I think some other people are gonna find it really valuable too.
cool. Well, thanks again, dude. Really appreciate you taking the time.
All right, man. We'll see you.
Okay.